So what I intend to do with this video is to lay out a process for penciling. And one thing to clarify beforehand is that this is not a video about how to draw. Videos on how to draw anatomy, how to draw layout, how to draw in perspective, all of those things proliferate across YouTube, many of which are extremely high quality, and there's very little sense in me repeating them. But one thing you don't hear as much about is process. And with this whole series of videos, what I'm trying to do is provide the process that I use in order to keep moving. So, like I talked about in the writing video, frequently you can get stuck with just this blank page syndrome where you look at the page, you're not sure what to do next, either in writing or in drawing. This is how to get past that, because comics require hundreds of pages to be drawn. And unless you're being extremely consistent, that would take an extraordinarily long amount of time. So the goal here is to do exactly that, to get you comfortable with a process that keeps you moving and keeps you going through stages of uncertainty into certainty. And so that's what we're going to do with this. We're going to take penciling and we're going to break it down into a process, because drawing in pencil for comics is very much a search for something. If it wasn't a search, we would just go straight to ink. We would just go straight to the final line. So obviously, you're looking for something as you pencil. If you accept that at the beginning, it's easier to get started. And then also, if you take the search and you are precise about what it is you're looking for, and then you break what you're looking for up into stages that are properly ordered, you can go through a pencil process very rapidly, get to a page that looks good in a much more efficient way than you would if you were just going at it with no order, no organization, and nothing in particular that you're looking for. And so this is going to be my pencil process. This is how I draw pages. And I'm going to use some of my own pages as an example to help clarify these things as far as the stages that I break it up in and what I'm looking for at each stage. For me, pencils always take place in three basic stages. One of them is the blue stage. I always color the pencils that I use. And in the blue stage, what I'm looking for is gesture. I'm looking for the general composition of things, where things are positioned. So there's a little bit of layout that's involved here. How many panels there are going to be, and what's going to be within those panels. And then as far as the figures are concerned, I'm looking for a couple of basic things. One of them is just the movement. And this is typically what gesture drawing refers to anyway. I'm going to find kind of the arc of the spine, the major lines of the figure. What direction are their arms pointed? What direction are their legs pointed? And most importantly, how is their body bent and oriented within the frame? Because a lot of emotion comes from this. And so if you are careful in the beginning as to try and work that out, you'll get a lot more energy into the piece rather than just going to drawing the body directly. And so typically I'm looking for chest, shoulders, back. How are these things oriented to each other? And then how does the head align on those? That way, if I throw a body forward or if I stretch them back, it should be visible in the gesture stage. This stage is incredibly important. It's incredibly important because it kind of determines the way that the characters are going to feel, the way that the page is going to feel, how the action is going to flow throughout it. But it's also by far the easiest one to draw, because what you should do is put no pressure on yourself to figure out any details whatsoever. That means that I'm free to draw, erase, fix things, because no effort goes into the drawing. It's all done so quickly. There's nothing to be lost if I erase something. So this is an extraordinarily important stage. It's where you establish a ton of important things, but the pressure is zero because you're not putting all that much work into any one of them, except just doing them repeatedly until you get the right feeling. So erasing is expected to be a part of this. You should be erasing constantly, going back and redoing it. So what we have here is Theseus page 149. This is a page where he happens upon the goddess Demeter and finds himself on her wrong side rather quickly. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that off and show some of the original sketch work here. So this is the gesture stage. This is just trying to get those emotional elements in place. And so if you look at this top series of 3 panels, we have the small panel of her laughing, And then we've got his sheepish return laugh, where obviously he's a little bit concerned. And then she leaps up and she pushes towards him and he falls backwards. And so if I'm trying to determine this from the narrative, if I'm trying to visualize this from the narrative, what I really want most are those basic emotions you see in the first two panels. And so I want to see her creepy laugh. And then I want to see his return expression, which is a little bit through his pose, but this one is mostly through the face. And so you'll notice I didn't even really draw out the body. I mostly just threw in the face to make sure that I got the emotion. So then when we move on to that next one, I swivel the camera around. I know I want to see him falling backwards, and I want to see her leaning forward. And so getting this whole look of her arms thrown back, her shoulders up, and her head thrust forward, this is just about capturing that gesture. On page 267 of Theseus, I have him fighting the Marathonian bull. And this one is an action sequence where he rushes towards it, throws a spear, hits it in the face, and then the two rush towards each other. And then when the complicated parts, it swings its horns down and he leaps up onto the horn and pulls himself up to where he's leaping on top of it with a sword. The second stage is what I would call the structure stage. And typically what I'm doing in this stage is I'm not dealing with particular detail. Occasionally there will be a little bit of clothing and a few little details that find their way in, but mostly what I'm doing here is I'm taking that gesture that I put in before and I'm finding the actual structural anatomy that's underneath it. So if when I did that really fast drawing, the arms and legs are completely out of whack, this is the stage where I would fix it. So I'm probably not going to detail all the little fingers. Fists are just going to be kind of blocks. I'm just trying to get to where everything is accurate to what it would be in the real world. If I'm doing a location, this is where I would do the linear perspective. I would figure out where the vanishing point is in the distance and how all the lines go back to that vanishing point and how things actually look structurally. It's a lot of cleanup and it's a lot of clarification, and it's taking your crazy idea and turning it into a form that can actually manifest on a page and not be confusing. So this is kind of like the intellectual moment. The blue gesture stage is much more emotional. It's eccentric. It's innovative. You're just coming up with ideas and just throwing them out on the page. It's almost like a visual brainstorm. But when you get to the structure one, that's when you tame what you've just done. You pull it back a little bit and you turn it into something that's actually usable by finding the anatomy, finding the perspective, and creating structure. Once I switch over to this structured view of page 267, you can see that I'm trying to figure out much more how these things are put together. And so I'm a little more careful about even small figure details, like down here he's picking this weapon up because he just threw a spear, so he's picking up a sword. Get a little bit more of the face. And then as he's going up here, this is one where I knew that I really had to work out the structure, and you can tell by all the erased bits that it took me a few times where that arm is slung around behind and then he's leaping up on top of this horn. I wanted to get the arc of the back, figure out exactly where that was, get this leg looking relatively natural, as well as that bend of the shoulder backwards. On page 302, I have him falling off a ship and into the water where he's then confronted by sirens. Once we move on to the structure stage, there's a little bit more clarity of where things fall. And to be honest, this one in many places is slightly more developed than I would usually do at the structure stage. And part of that was because I knew the hair had to be floating and it was part of the panel in a way. So I couldn't leave it to chance the same way that I did before. After the structure stage is the detail stage. And this is what a more refined pencil would be. This is when I actually put the costumes on the figures. And this is when I actually lay down the lines that ink is going to go on top of. Ink always provides a little bit more information, especially with me. I tend to do most of the value in the ink stage. Occasionally I'll put some shadows in things in pencil, but primarily what I'm getting are the final sort of lines that are going to guide the inking. And so here I do need to see fully fleshed out facial expressions. I do need to see hair in motion. I need to see cloth in motion. I need to see things as they will actually be, because once it gets to the ink stage, I would prefer to be thinking about other things rather than finding lines. With most artists, if they're doing their own pencils and inks, there's always some gaps. There's some things I just know I'm going to do in inking. A lot of that is vegetation. I tend to do most of my vegetation in inking rather than penciling the whole thing. But it varies from artist to artist. But primarily what I'm doing here is getting into that state of preparation for ink. And so everything has to be more or less picked at this point. Everything has to be decided as far as how the figures look, what they're wearing, how their hair is blowing. That gets done in the stage of detail. And so what I've done is I've created a funnel system here as well, just like I do in the writing process, where it starts out with the broad and the foundational, the emotion, the movement, the layout, the composition. And then it moves to the fundamental structure. It's like the girders, the stud wall, where you put that up. It's not polished. It's just like seeing underneath, but it's the thing that holds everything up and makes it structurally sound. And then on top of that, the polish, the detail, the final thoughts before it moves on to inking. When you move on to the detail stage for page 302, you get far more visual information. You get the clothing, you get the facial expressions, you get a lot of bubbles and things that you wouldn't get otherwise, and you just get more detail. And that is that finalization, getting it ready for inking. On page 149, where we look at the finished, I've gone in and detailed things like her crown. Up here at the top here, you can see the X's for the black, and then you can also see the crown that I've got on top of her, and then of course the facial expression, this conflicted smile and the eyebrows down. All of those elements are in place. And then if I go further down and look at the corner, you can see where now I can see her anatomy with much more clarity, but also the clothing has been placed on top, which is really the best way to do clothing, and I can see him scrabbling away at the bottom. If you take pencils and you break them up in this way, it's far more approachable. It keeps you from having to worry about everything at once, and it tends to strengthen a lot of things that otherwise get overlooked. The temptation with especially a new comic artist is that when you pencil, you're just laying down good lines. And so people go to just drawing figures without working out the anatomy first. They just go straight to drawing the clothing on top of the figure. And that's a horrific way to draw. That's a good way to get stiff and lifeless looking figures. You need the emotion and the gesture, the structure, and then those things. And so if you break it up into stages on purpose and get each of those done in order, your drawing will simply turn out better, and it will keep you moving. It will keep you from getting stuck thinking, well, now I've got to draw a counter with a bunch of objects on it and a bunch of bottles and glasses, etc. If I'm doing it in this form, I would have already drawn the basic counter. I would have already figured out the layout and the perspective. By the time I got to drawing all those little details, that's all there would be left to do. And it makes it feel much more manageable, especially when you feel overwhelmed by the complexity of a specific page, because some pages are more complex than others. It can make it very, very difficult to keep going. And then with something like an action panel where you've got a lot of movement, if you go straight to just drawing it without this gestural aspect, it tends to feel a lot slower. It feels like characters aren't really moving fast. It feels like the poses aren't quite exaggerated enough as they need to be when you're drawing stylistically. So this provides opportunity to solve a lot of problems that I ran into early in my drawing career that now mostly get taken care of just by splitting it up into these stages and knowing what to expect and knowing exactly what I'm looking for. So these are the basics of drawing in pencil for a comic page. It's intended to keep you moving. It's intended to keep you going. It's intended to map out the most efficient way to get from blank page to penciled page. I did have an influx of subscribers since the last video, so if you like these videos, please do subscribe. It's extremely useful to me, and apparently the algorithm likes it quite a lot, so continue doing that. And of course the reason I do any of this is because, for one, I love making comics, but also I put my comics out there for sale. So if you're intrigued by the idea of any of the pages you've seen, or if you just like ancient Greece, comedy mixed with ancient Greece, and something that tries to be an all-around good story, go look at those at the link below. I also have a newsletter, which is my primary way of reaching people, and so you can find a link for that below as well.